Okay, so this chapter is on cognition, which is thinking, a language, and intelligence. So before we get started, make sure that you check out this video. If you don't want to watch the whole thing, I suggest that you do. It has a lot of really good information in it. But if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, at the very least, watch this 5-minute clip from 19 minutes and 14 seconds to 24 minutes and 7 seconds. Okay, so when we're talking about thinking, we're talking about the elements of cognition, trying to break it down into its most basic pieces. And so when we do that, we come up with these different basic parts of thinking. So first we have a concept. And concepts are mental categories that group objects, relations, activities, abstractions, qualities. Concepts are the smallest unit of knowledge. They simplify information about the world so that we can make decisions effectively. So if we wanted to, for example, come up with the concept of emotion, joy and anger could be the smallest units of those particular concepts. So concepts then are the building blocks of thoughts. Within these concept categories, we can come up with what are called prototypes. So a prototype is an especially representative example of a concept. And we use prototypes to decide if something belongs to a concept. So for example, if I asked you to think of a bird, many of you would probably say the first thing that comes to your mind is something like a raven or a robin or a bluebird. Most of you would not say a chicken is the first thing that comes to mind. So a raven is a more prototypical or representative. It's like an easy to conjure up example of this particular concept. A chicken or an ostrich, not exactly what we think about when we think about the category of birds. If I ask you to think of a flower, the first flower that probably comes to your mind is something like a rose. So that's what you think of. Maybe you think of a lily. These might be prototypical, very representative examples. You probably didn't say, oh, a cactus flower. Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to my mind, because that's not a prototypical example. That's not the first place that our minds go. So concepts then are the smallest unit of thought, and we group concepts together to form what are called propositions. So propositions are units of meaning that are made up of a concept, and they express some kind of unitary idea. So some kind of assertion that may be true or false. So for example, I might come up with the proposition based on this concept that, let's say I'm looking at the concept of flowers. I might say that all flowers are red because I'm thinking about my prototypical example of a rose. So we know that in some instances, that proposition is certainly true, right? But not in all instances. There are certainly flowers that are not red. So if you want to think about concepts and propositions in terms of chemistry, you can think of a concept as similar to an atom, the smallest unit of matter, and then atoms combine together to form molecules. So molecules are like propositions. So this is a concept map. This concept map basically is about what causes the different seasons. Okay, so you can see we have seasons here. We have things about temperature variation. We have the names of the different seasons, the length of the day, distance to the sun. All of these things are related in the overall concept about what causes the seasons. So the concepts are in the boxes. So seasons, amount of sunlight, length of day, those are in the boxes. And then propositions are used to link the words, to link the concepts together. Okay, so for example, amount of sunlight and length of day are concepts, and they are linked by the proposition is determined by. So the amount of sunlight is determined by the length of day. We have some additional building blocks or elements of cognition. So we can look at what are called schemas. So schemas essentially are basically a way of viewing the world, okay? So this is integrated network with your knowledge, your beliefs, your expectations about a particular topic. So cognitive schemas then are propositions that are linked together in networks of knowledge, and they serve as basically as a mental model for the road. So you might have gender schemas, essentially what it means to be male, what it means to be female. And young children have very rigid gender schemas, right? They don't really allow for a lot of flexibility. There are girl toys and there are boy toys. And if girls play with boy toys, that is a problem, right? Little girls shouldn't do that based on this gender schema that young children often hold. In looking at an image, so images, right? These are basically the pictures that you have in your mind, these mental images, a picture about what this particular schema entails. So the images are essentially your mental pictures. Okay, so let's try and see what you know here. See if you can apply the information about those basic elements of cognition. So in this scenario, you go to get a hamburger to a fast food restaurant, you wait in line behind the counter. When it's your turn, tell the person by the cash register that you want a hamburger. The person will tell you how much it costs, give them enough money. In a few minutes, someone behind the counter will give you a hamburger. This kind of mental representation is best described as what? So if you picked a schema, you're correct. This is basically your understanding of the particular scenario, right, for what happens when you want to go get something to eat at a fast food place. Okay, so let's talk about consciousness in thought. And so if we're talking about levels of consciousness, remember when we talked before, we said that there are all different levels of conscious awareness, right? If you are avidly awake, paying attention, that's one level of consciousness. Sleeping is another level of consciousness. We can also look into what are called subconscious processing and non-conscious processing. So with subconscious processing, this is when you are processing information, but it's occurring outside of your immediate conscious awareness. But if you need to, you can access this information. You can snap right back into your consciousness if necessary. So for example, if you've had the experience of driving and you're driving a really familiar route, and you're driving a really familiar route, and you're driving along and not really paying attention, and someone suddenly pulls out in front of you and cuts you off, and whoo, you're right back, right? You are right back there in your extreme level of conscious awareness. So you could bring yourself right back into that very aware, very alert level if necessary. With reading a book, how many times have you been reading textbooks for your boring classes, and you find yourself reading something, but you don't really know what you read, right? You have no idea. You're like, did I just read that? God, I have no idea what's going on, right? You're looking at it, but you're not actually processing it, and so you have to kind of jolt yourself back into that level of conscious awareness where you can actually process what you're reading. So that's subconscious processing. Non-conscious processing, this is basically like behind the scenes processing. So stuff that goes on behind the scenes, your brain's basically working without you telling it to, essentially. It's something that is going on behind the scenes. So for example, let's say that you are trying to think of someone's name. And you're like, oh man, I remember that guy. You know, I just saw you today. I know I've met you before, but I really can't place you. But I know I've seen you before. And so you maybe think about it consciously, right? Like really willing your brain to try to think, where have I seen this person before? And you maybe think about that for 5 minutes and then forget about it, go on and do something else. Well, maybe 3 or 4 hours later, you're like, aha! I know who that guy is. He was in my freshman seminar class. Now I remember his name is Jim. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot that. So that is the result of your brain non-consciously processing. So even though you're not actually sitting there and trying to solve this problem, trying to think, where do I know this guy from? Your brain behind the scenes is still processing, is still trying to figure out a solution to that problem. And that's where you come up with the aha moment, when you have a sudden moment of insight. So there are other types of conscious processing that we engage in. So we can talk about implicit learning. So remember before when we talked about implicit memory, and we said that when something is implicit, it means that it's kind of operating on a different level. It's not blatantly obvious how it works. And so the same thing applies then to implicit learning. So with implicit learning, you've learned something, but you don't really know exactly how you've learned it. It's been this ongoing process and you're not 100% sure how you actually learned it. So for example, learning how to speak your native language. So you can all speak whatever your first language is, but trying to document exactly how that happened, it's not really something that we're capable of, right? And we'll talk about language development and how essentially children learn to speak when we get into the chapter on development. There's also mindlessness. So this is that semi-conscious processing, mindlessness, where basically you are acting, speaking, making decisions without really processing relevant information. So if you have ever been sitting in front of a television, eating your dinner, are you really processing the food that you're eating? My guess would be probably not, right? You're kind of oblivious to what's going on in the present context. Okay, so what are these mental processes that occur outside of conscious awareness but are accessible to consciousness when necessary? Is this subconscious processing, non-conscious processing, implicit learning, or mindlessness? If you pick subconscious processing, good job, you got it right, great work. Okay, so now we're going to move into specific types of thinking and also some problems that we have in our thinking, biases that we use to try to make things easier for us. They're like mental shortcuts. But the problem with these biases is that sometimes they lead us astray. Sometimes they basically cause us to not consider all of the relevant information. Okay, so reasoning then. This is one type of conscious processing, right? And reasoning is considered a higher level thinking process. So with reasoning, you're trying to draw conclusions, trying to infer. It's basically trying to figure out what's going on based on observations, on facts, or on assumptions. And you're trying to draw conclusions for that. So with reasoning, there are, again, a number of different ways that we reason, that we try to figure out answers to problems. One way that we might try to figure out is by using an algorithm. So algorithms, you have probably heard of these if you've ever taken a calculus class. But algorithms are basically a set of procedures that's guaranteed. So every single time, if you follow these particular steps, you will arrive at a solution. But it doesn't require that you understand how the formula really works, right? How the set of procedures really works. But you will get an answer. You will get a solution. So in math, we might talk about basically like plugging numbers into an equation and working the equation to come up with a solution. So that's an algorithm. We might also talk about recipes, right? So recipes, if you combine these ingredients in this order, you will always come up with a solution. So there are, as I said, some problems with rational thinking. So we have some biases. We have what we call heuristics. And heuristics are basically these little shortcuts that we use. It's like a rule of thumb. It suggests a particular course of action. It guides your problem solving, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you are going to arrive at the best or the most optimal solution. Okay, so that's a heuristic, a rule of thumb. It's like a mental shortcut. So with heuristics, there are several different basically biases that we use when applying these rules of thumb. Okay, so the first one is called the affect heuristic. And remember when we covered the chapter on motivation and emotion, we said that affect is another word for emotion. So it makes sense then that the affect heuristic is the tendency to consult your emotions, how you feel about a particular scenario, instead of using your rational thinking or logical thinking to arrive at an answer. So for example, if we're looking at the affect heuristic, we might find that when people are asked about their opinions on nuclear power, they're perhaps more likely to consult their emotional feelings. So how do you feel about nuclear power? Instead of weighing the pros and the cons, weighing the costs and the benefits of nuclear power. So weighing the costs and the benefits would be relying more on rationality, on rational thinking. And how you feel about nuclear power would be more about emotion, right? About consulting your emotions. So that's the affect heuristic. Next, we have what's called the availability heuristic. So the availability heuristic is basically when we judge how likely it is that an event will happen based on how easy it is, how available examples of that event are. Okay, so how likely it is that an event will happen based on how available, how easy it is to think of that particular event, to think of examples of that. So with the availability heuristic, when something like a plane crash happens, that gets a lot of media coverage, right? It'll be on every news station, be in every newspaper. You'll hear about it for weeks and weeks. But statistically speaking, plane crashes are very, very rare, right? It's actually safer to fly in a plane than it is to drive in a car. But because we have many examples of plane crashes available to our immediate consciousness, we tend to think that plane crashes are really common. They happen all of the time, even though that is not the case. And the same thing with shark attacks, right? These are really, really rare, but when they happen, they get a lot of media coverage, right? Which makes them very available, makes it very easy for us to think of these particular instances. There's also another bias that we use in thinking. It's called the hindsight bias. And the hindsight bias is basically when you say, oh, I knew that all along. So this is basically, if I knew then what I know now, I would have been able to make a better decision. So this is after an event has already happened, and then you claim, yeah, I knew that that was going to happen. I told you so. I knew that was going to happen. So let's say that you have a couple of friends who are in a relationship and then they break up. And you're like, yep, I knew it. I knew that that relationship wasn't going to last. But you're only saying that after it has already happened, right? So that's called the hindsight bias. Hindsight, being able to look behind you, literally. Okay, so we also have what's called the confirmation bias. And so with the confirmation bias then, you're basically only looking for information that confirms, that supports what you already think. So many of you have to do research papers, right, for your classes. And if you are writing a research paper on the problems with standardized testing in schools, and you have already decided your position that you think standardized testing is one of the worst ideas ever, if you're exhibiting the confirmation bias, when you go to research information about standardized testing in schools, you will only look for research that supports your position, right? That confirms your outlook. So you're only looking for research that also says, yes, standardized testing is terrible for schools. So you only pay attention to information that goes with what you already believe, and you basically ignore information that doesn't match up with what you believe. So that's the confirmation bias. We also have another bias in thinking. This is called mental set. Okay, and with mental set, we basically try to solve problems using procedures that have worked in the past, that have already been tried, that we know are already successful. And the good thing about mental set is that when we encounter a new problem, a lot of times we can try to solve it more efficiently because we're applying tools that we know have already worked in the past, right? We've already tried this approach. I know it's going to work this time, so it allows you to move through problems more efficiently. So that's the plus, the good thing about mental set. The bad thing is that sometimes we encounter problems that may seem like a problem that we've dealt with before, but they're not exactly the same. And so sometimes problems that we encounter call for a new approach, right? We need to come up with a different way to solve this particular problem. And when we're stuck with this mental set, we have a really, really hard time coming up with potential solutions because we're so focused on what we've done in the past. We have a hard time coming up with a fresh, new way, thinking outside of the box, literally. Particular problem here, it's because you're stuck with mental set, right? We try to use the same approaches that we've used before, but in this particular scenario, they don't work, okay? So make sure that you go check out this website here so that you can see the solutions to the 9-dot problem. And if you solved it without having seen it before, I know several of you have probably already seen this, so that's cheating if you already know the answer. But if you solved it without having seen this problem before, that means that you're probably a person who's good at coming up with creative solutions to problems. So pat yourself on the back. Good work.